too long for YouTube.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you can. We changed the title slightly.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now. This is part of the Journal of Supply Chain Management's research methods series. We had several methods webinars earlier this year.
All right.
And we're continuing this summer. Go ahead. And we'll continue with our method seminar this morning here in the central part of the United States, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are located in our webinar. So I'd like to thank John Gray and Sachin Modi for leading this virtual method series. And so I'd like to turn it over to Sachin, who will begin with some introductions.
So thank you, Dave, for inviting me and John to do this. Hi, I'm Sachin Modi. I am a professor of global supply chain management at the Mike Kellett School of Business. Very happy to be doing this seminar with John. I'm going to turn it over to John, who will introduce himself and then start us off, and then we'll toggle back and forth throughout the webinar. So John, all yours to get started.
Okay. So I'm John Gray. I'm a professor of operations and business analytics at the Fisher College of Business at Ohio State. Been here for 16 years and have struggled with causal inference for most of those, including my dissertation. So looking forward to talking about this with all of you. And so my clicking works, there we go. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk very broadly and generally about causal inference and quasi-experiments. And I'm going to handle most of that discussion, just a few slides. And then I'll turn it over to Sachin, who will add to whatever I said, and he also might interrupt me in the process of my discussion. And then we're going to talk about two specific techniques. We'll talk about how these fit in the broader picture of causal inference using observational data. Sachin will talk in quite a bit of detail about difference and difference, and I will talk in a little bit less detail about regression discontinuity. And then we'll wrap up, and we should have time for open discussion. Neither Sachin nor I can easily see the chat. However, David, when he's in the room, and Jacqueline will be here the whole time, and they will be monitoring the chat. And so we've asked them to interrupt us as needed if there's a question during the session. So we will just keep going until we're interrupted by one of them. Okay. So causal inference in general. I mean, just speak very high level about it, very broadly about it. I mean, as researchers, we often, if not almost always, want to try to understand, what causes some outcome of interest. And so how some X affects some Y, basically, on average in some population of interest. That's often what our research is. It's often what we're trying to do. And the economists always use the word the gold standard. The cleanest way to do this is to randomize, and to randomize the treatments, randomize the group that gets treated, randomize the group that gets controlled. And you have to be very careful with this and do a lot of other things that we're not going to get into. We're not going to talk about experimental design, but basically, if you do that well, then whatever you can compare the treated and untreated group, you can be confident in some causal claims, because the treated and untreated groups are comparable in both observable and unobservable characteristics, because you have randomized them. Okay, but in OM, it's often difficult to do that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides with maybe some examples from my own research. And so we often instead gather observational data, either primary data collection using surveys, or secondary data collection, or some combination. And so we gather databases and we try to make causal claims with observational data, which is really hard. It's really fraught with challenges, and it's almost impossible to do perfectly. And so again, that's the broad challenge of causal inference. So when you decided to use observational data to try to make causal claims, one of the terminologies used is sort of you're doing some sort of quasi-experimental approach. And the goal is, again, to identify the effect of some treatment on some Y. It's just more difficult to do so. So you're either comparing, and we're talking about treated units and control units as if there's only two groups. So the X is essentially a dummy variable or dichotomous variable. And actually in both methods that Sachin and I are going to talk about today, that's the common situation that you find yourself in. A lot of what I'm going to talk about just on this slide also applies if the X variable is some sort of continuous variable or some sort of non-dichotomous variable. But we're going to talk a lot about treated control. It's just a lot easier to speak about that, and it's cleaner, and both of our methods use that usually are in that type of setting. So a key is we're not using randomization. Okay, so we typically are unable to randomize the treatment and control when we're using observational data. And so what do we do? So there's two situations where this is necessary. One is where you just, maybe you could do a lab experiment, but you feel it's just too far removed from the reality. So an example I just thought of when I was thinking about this before talking is maybe like you want to see the effect of teammates' pay on a team member's morale or motivation. And so it'd be really hard to create the history and the feelings when it's your own real pay and your real job in a lab setting, right? So maybe you probably could construct a lab environment that might sort of capture that. But if you feel like it's just too difficult to really get external validity in a lab, that's one reason you might instead go out into the field and gather or go to your computer and gather secondary data or primary data. And the other situation where I use this is where field experiments are impractical. So I don't know if it's an emerging, but seems to be a little bit more common technique in our field, is to actually try to go out in the field and do an intervention in the field, where you really have to get some large company or large organization to agree to randomly implement a practice in, say, one group and not another. It's very hard to truly get true randomization, but you can get kind of close. And so I know Arvind, my colleague Arvind Chandrasekharan, has done some of that in medical with our hospital here, with other hospitals around the country, where they've implemented some operational practices in, say, the kidney unit, not the heart unit, or something like that. So field experiments are another way around this, but they're also somewhat imperfect. I did see a hand that popped up. I don't know if we want to allow interruptions or how you want to handle that, David, but I don't know what it, or maybe you're still muted. Maybe typing questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So we know what's coming. Yeah.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions throughout, please let us know, and we'll try to answer your questions to the best of our ability.
So when you have, when you're doing this quasi experiment, you have to make more assumptions. So you basically, if you're going to make a causal claim, you're assuming that the treatment groups are comparable for binary treatments. And you can check that with observable. You can even match on observable characteristics. You can control for observable characteristics. You can do various things. But the unobservables is where you have the problem. So things that you can't see in the individual or the team or the organization are difficult to assess, and often the real challenge in making causal claims with observational data is these unobservables. You know, are the groups that chose to get into the treatment, are the groups that chose to, an example here is my never published dissertation research on contract manufacturing and quality risk. 5 journals, 13 submissions, something like that. You know, I think it's a great paper. It's on SSRN, but you know, we never really could convince reviewers that drugs that were contract manufactured weren't fundamentally different than drugs that were manufactured internally, and we never could really come up with an instrument or come up with a method that really could convince reviewers of that. So the unobservables there, we didn't have the key drug characteristics in that paper to be able to really deal with unobservables. Okay. And so the biggest challenge, and I like this language, this came, Miko Ketevi and Monterey, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, they had an AMR paper, and I think they also had a JOM paper that talked about the same thing. And I believe this language is filtered into the field a little bit. Are your claims warranted by your approach? So in any research, you know, whatever you're claiming, do the reviewers and the editors and eventually the readers believe that they're warranted? That's a key object of the review process, is to make sure that the claims that are made, which if they're important, might then get picked up by practice and the press and policymakers. Are they warranted by your approach? And they never perfectly are. The observational data is but are they close enough? You know, do we believe that this is close enough to the correct? These claims are valid enough that we can publish this paper. have you dealt with alternative explanations? So, in the contract manufacturing case, I lost. I never convinced reviewers that I dealt with things well enough. Other papers, one of which we'll talk about later, we did convince reviewers and convince ourselves, of course, first, but we're able to convince reviewers that we had dealt with alternative explanations. So I'm going to turn it over to Sachin. So if there is a question that needs answering now, it's a decent time. Otherwise, I will continue to move on.
Yeah, if anyone has a questions, please go ahead and type it in chat, and John and I can field them before I get started.
It looks like there are none. The chat was just encouraging people to type into the chat. So
yeah. So, one of the things that I believe is really critical, and I'll just reiterate what John said on the previous slide, right, is a lot of times, and especially as we get more into the techniques, especially DID, when we are creating our treatment and control groups, it is really important to make sure that they're comparable. And a lot of times the observables are something that you may be able to test and do a good job with. But making sure that the unobservables are as similar, it can't be really tested, and this is a critical assumption that you want to remember you're making whenever we are working with DID specifically. Now, moving on to our next slide, we are going to talk today about two experimental techniques. I will focus primarily on the difference in difference and talk through that, and John will walk us through the regression discontinuity. One of the things that I love about these techniques, and the various conversations John and I have had recently, we both agree, is they're really, really elegant and simple. And they're relatively conceptually, analytically both simple to implement, but they're really elegant in the sense that they can allow us to capture the causal inference that we want. If you just hit, yep. Now, one of the things that you really want to remember is that both of these techniques require that you find the right setting. The way I think about it is, both of these settings will work with two kinds of groups. And a lot of times people say that, hey, if I compare apples to apples, I'm good enough. But in both of these settings, especially in DID, you want to be sure that it's not just about comparing apples to apples. You're trying to compare Honeycrisp apples to Honeycrisp apples. So you want to make sure that you're really making sure there is as much comparability as possible in your research that you're doing. Both of these also require a setting where your treatment or your threshold is exogenous shock. So if your treatment is endogenous, you end up with the similar problems that you would end up otherwise. So as we start on these techniques, we want to make sure that we are using the techniques in the right setting. And this also gets back to what John said, right? Are the claims that you're making after using these warranted? And whether you're applying them in the right setting will feed into whether the claims are warranted as well, amongst other things that would warrant those claims. So I think let's get started with the what is difference in difference. As John said, it's a quasi-experimental technique. We want to compare outcomes in two populations or groups, and through most of the presentation, as I talk through it, I'll work with a two group and a two time period setting, just because that really helps us build a basic intuition. It's easier to understand and handle, and once you really get a grasp of that, it is pretty easy to generalize the model. I had a quick question that popped up on my chat. I'm just gonna try to address that quickly as I go on. So how many different factors can be considered to check the differences? I am assuming this relates to factors to check to make sure your treatment and controls are comparable. I don't think there is a number that you're actually trying to get to that I want to check a few things. You want to make sure that they are broadly comparable on whatever characteristics that you have measurable as observables. And we can come back to that question later in the presentation. I'll ask John to chime in as well.
Yeah, I'll just say that anything you can check is by definition observable. So it doesn't, no matter how many factors you check, it's not going to resolve the challenge of the unobservable differences between the treated and control, if we understood that question correctly.
Yeah. And for lack of a better way of saying this, I mean, I would say that try to check as many as you can, because the more sure you are that you're having comparability, the better it is. So coming back, we are trying to compare outcomes over time and between two groups or populations. And you'll typically apply DiD when you have a certain population that has experienced a certain treatment, right? So you're interested whether an exogenous shock or a treatment or a policy change is having an effect. So there has to be a group that has experienced that. Now, to really try to get an estimate of the effect of that treatment, you also need a control group. This would be a population or a set of observations which have definitely not experienced the treatment that you're interested in. Now, in the ideal case, you would be able to use randomization and assign different observational units to different treated and control groups. Now, we can't do that in quasi-experimental settings. So nature does the randomization for us, right? You have a group that was treated, and you hope that there are no systematic differences between your control and treated groups. And if there are, you would either control for it or account for that. There is a very important assumption that any DiD analysis relies on, and it's called the equal trends assumption. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. But that is a really important assumption that we make whenever we work with DiD. John, if you go back to the previous one. Sorry about that. Now, once again, I'm going to reiterate, we use DiD to understand the effect of exogenous event. So your shock that you're interested in, or the treatment you're interested in, is by definition an exogenous shock or an exogenous treatment. Typical examples of this would be changes in policy or an enactment of policy or a passage of law that might affect a certain group and not affect a different group. And as we mentioned earlier, right, designed interventions with a field experiment. That would be another typical setting where we use this. DiD is becoming increasingly popular in business research. I mean, it's been around for a really long time. It is, as you will see by the end of our talk today, that it's a very simple technique to implement. And it's been used for a very long time. It's becoming really popular in business research, especially operations and supply chain research, as we get more careful about making causal inferences. And we really try to find, and there are very creative ways in which you can identify exogenous shocks. We'll talk through a few examples towards the end of our segment here. The technique is relatively simpler. So let's take a quick look at a picture that will help us develop a very basic intuition of what happens when we use DiD. A quick question popped up: if policy impacts an entire group, how will we apply it? We will get back to that question when we talk about an example later, where if you have a mandate that comes in, there might be a creative way to come up with a control group. So I'm going to hold that off till later. If we look at the basic intuition or the setup of DiD model, we do need and I've said this numerous times, right? A natural intervention or a shock that is exogenous. And what we are interested in is seeing whether this exogenous shock has an impact on some outcome that we are interested in. So we have an outcome of interest and an exogenous shock. And we will have a group that has experienced that exogenous shock. So we will have a certain number of people or a certain number of observational unit that have received the treatment or experienced an exogenous shock. What we also need is a control group or observational units that have not experienced this exogenous shock. So now we have a setting where we have a shock, an outcome of interest. We have a group that has experienced the exogenous shock and a group that has not experienced the exogenous shock. What we also want is an observation of these two groups before the shock and after the shock. So we have 2 time periods, right? So we want to make sure that we have observations about these groups before the shock or the intervention happened, and after the shock or the intervention happened. So now we are in a 2-group, 2-time period setting. We have a treated group, a control group, a pre-time period, and a post-time period. What is really critical, and I had pointed this out earlier, is this parallel trends assumption. From the pre-period till the shock happens, we are assuming that our control and treated groups are very, very, very similar. And what that implies is that any changes that happen in our outcome of interest between our start of the observation period until when they experience the shock is going to be pretty much exactly the same in the 2 groups. Because if you violate your parallel trends assumption, you know that there's something else that could cause those changes. So anything that you estimate may not be clean as a estimate. A quick question popped up is, if the treatment is endogenous, can we still use DiD? We may not get into those issues today, but basically you're in a situation where you have endogenous treatment. You could statistically apply it, but you cannot make valid conclusions with the endogenous treatment when you use DiD, unless you have been able to instrument your treatment, in which case you're back into a instrumental variable setting. So, but we can get back to some of those in the open discussion as well, because as we said earlier, right, your setting and where you're applying the technique is really important. And that's where when John and I were discussing this earlier too, these are simple techniques, but they're relatively simple conceptually and empirically, because a little misstep in how and where you apply it does have consequences where you might find a causal inference and it doesn't exist, or you have a little confound that you've missed in your understanding. So what we are interested in, after we have checked for this parallel trends assumption, is to really see whether this intervention has an effect post treatment. So we're really interested in trying to estimate what is the change for this group that we can attribute to the exogenous shock in our variable of interest. Now, if we have a 2-group, 2-period setting, let us try to verbalize this basic intuition to see how we can find that estimate. So if we just flick forward, John. Yeah. So we can take a difference in the outcome of interest that we are observing in the time period before and the time period after for the treated group. So basically taking the Y and the treated group and average before and a average after, the difference in those two. So your Y in the treatment group post minus the Y in the treatment group pre. You can also very easily calculate the difference in your outcome in the control group pre and post. So your Y in the control group post minus the Y in the control group pre. So we have calculated just a difference before and after. Now we could also difference the differences that we have calculated. So what is the difference between the difference in Y pre and post in the treated and the difference in Y pre and post in the control group? So we have basically taken the difference of difference. Essentially, this is what we're doing, and this is where we call the technique difference in difference. And as we look through some of the next slides, we'll try to build this intuition up a little more to see exactly what is happening. Now, if we think about the outcomes that we have our 2-group treatment and control group and 2-period setting, pre and post. We can observe the Y, our variable of interest, in the treatment group and in the control group in the pre-period. We can observe our Y in the treatment group and the control group post-period. Now, a lot of you who are familiar with panel data, since you have a 2-period setting, we can take a within difference or a between difference. So if we take the difference post minus pre in the treated group, we're taking a within difference. Post minus pre in the control group, we're taking a within difference in our control group. We could go about it the other way around too. We can take a between difference in our treated minus control and our post-treated minus control. So we have taken the first difference that we talked about in the previous slide. And our difference is nothing but the differences of these either between differences or the within differences. So our difference between the treated minus the difference between the control is our estimate for the treatment effect or the difference in the post minus the difference in the pre-groups, once again gives us our difference in difference estimate. Now remember, we are again taking two differences, and that's where we call this difference in difference. Any questions so far? I don't see anything pop up, so I'm going to keep going. Now, if we take this to the next step and we formalize this just a little bit to see how we can actually estimate it, we can create a dummy variable for, remember, we two-group, two-period setting, right? So for identifying or for specifying both of those, we can create a dummy for each of the two factors we have. So we can create a dummy that is treat, which takes on a value of 1 for all the observations that are in our treatment group, takes on a value of 0 for the control. And we'll create a dummy that takes on a value of 1 for all observations in the post period, takes on a value of 0 in the pre-period, right? Now, if we create an interaction of those, treat times post, we have an interaction term that is the treatment group observations in the post period. And that is the effect that we are really interested in trying to specify or trying to understand. So once we have our two dummies, or we can of course have all our other vector of covariates in the error term, we can run a simple regression, which is essentially running a regression with our dummy variables and an interaction term for that. And we'll get our estimates for beta 0, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, and our vector of control estimates. Now let's take a look at this and formalize it one step further. Once we have estimated our betas, we can find what is our expected effects for any of the conditions that we are interested in. So what would be the expected outcome when treat equal to 1 and post equal to 1? So we'll have a 1 and 1 there, and the interaction term will be 1. Our estimated effect on y is beta 0 plus beta 1, beta 2 plus beta 3. Similarly, if I do what happens when treat equal to 1 and post equal to 0, I'm just going to start putting zeros and 1 up here and get my relevant betas. So treat equal to 1, post equal to 0 gives me beta 0 plus beta 1. Similarly, treat equal to 0, post equal to 1 gives me beta 0 plus beta 2. And when both are set to 0, my estimated effect on y is beta 0. Let's put this back in our earlier little table. So once again, we have a treatment group, control group, pre and post. And what I have done here is I have just put the estimates that we have from our regression model. And now we are again going to try to difference within, difference between, and then do a difference in difference. So if I do a difference in within for the treatment group, I'll take the post minus the pre. So I'm going to lose the beta 0, beta 1. My difference is beta 2 plus beta 3. I'm going to do the same for my control group. I'm going to drop the beta 0. My difference is beta 2. Now, if I do my difference between, I'm going to drop the beta 0 for the pre-period. My difference is beta 1. For the post-period, I'm going to drop the beta 0 and the beta 2. My difference is beta 1 plus beta 3. Now, remember, we were taking the difference of these two differences to get to our intervention effect. So I can either go beta 1 plus beta 3 minus beta 1, get to my intervention effect. Or I can do a beta 2 plus beta 3 minus beta 2 and get to my intervention effect. So hopefully this helps you build an intuition as we start from a two-period, two-group setting where you'll see a lot of times DiD applied. Why do we run a regression with the two dummy variables for treated and post? And why are we interested in the interaction term? Because that beta 3, the interaction term beta, is our estimated intervention effect that we are after. So in terms of applying it, once you have your treated and control group and the various observations over time, right now in a two-period setting, it's relatively simple and easy to create the dummy variables and run the regression. Right? So in that sense, the technique is very simple. It's also very elegant in the sense that it has allowed you to tease out the effect that you can attribute as a causal effect. The key being there, again, your treated and control groups are comparable on the observable and the unobservable. And your treatment or event is more or less exogenous, within practical bounds that we worry about. You can extend this model to a more general model. We can extend it to multiple groups and multiple time periods. We simply will start to add our unit fixed effects and time fixed effects. You could, instead of having these unit fixed effects and time fixed effects, define these along your group fixed effects and period fixed effects. So if you do a multi-phase design where you have a pre-period, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, your time will be divided along those phases. If instead of one treated group, you have multiple treated groups, you will have multiple treated group effects specified here. You might be interested in an overall treatment effect, but if you have multiple treated groups, you're really interested in treatment effects across those different groups. So you'll have multiple interaction terms at that time, one for each group and phase that you're interested in. But the model is very easily generalizable to a multi-group, multi-period setting. And once again, you're always going to be interested in the interaction term coefficients, because those are the coefficients that are going to tell you what is your estimated interaction or what is your estimated treatment effect. Now, coming back to what we had in the figure, let's talk through what we just talked through and go back to our figure. We have our parallel trends assumption that we have made. Our difference between the treated and control group is beta 1, going back to the first equation I had put up there. Now, because we don't observe what would happen in the treated group had the treatment not occurred, we kind of have a counterfactual that we can create for that. So we are assuming that this here, the unobserved difference between treated and control group, would be the same had the treatment not occurred. And that's where it's really important to make sure that your groups are comparable and your treatment is exogenous. We observe the trend in the control group. This is something that we actually observe. We also observe our post-treatment trend in the treated group. And that beta 3 is the effect that we are really interested in. That is the effect that we are attributing to our intervention or shock. And I keep going back to this, but once again, remember, we have made sure that our shock is exogenous and our groups are comparable. And if these are really comparable and this parallel trends assumption holds, you can attribute this change in trend to this intervention or shock, which is exogenous. So that kind of is the basic intuition that we do with a difference in difference model. That we would.
So I think we have at least one or two questions in the chat box, Sachin and John.
What if the treatment is endogenous? Okay, so I have a question here. What if the effect is nonlinear and goes back to the pre-intervention level right after the intervention? That's interesting. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, going back to if something, I see this question as like if something else happened in the world at the same time as the intervention.
Yeah.
Hopefully, then, I mean, that obviously would confound things, but
yeah.
It would make you would hope that the effect was the same on the treated and the control group. But I think the basic idea of difference in difference, especially if it's an intervention that occurs only at one time to a treated group and not to a control group, that whatever else is going on in the world will affect both groups approximately equally, so that going back to pre-intervention level would also affect the control group, hopefully. That's the only answer I have for that. I can comment on the next one because I've done this. If the intervention time is different, but the intervention is the same, and we want to analyze DiD, how can we apply? And I've done that. So basically, you can normalize, for the treated group, you have to do some matching first, but you can find a control observation that's similar, or observations, and set time t equals 0 when the intervention occurred for the treated group, and then you have to obviously have some time fixed effects or a time variable in there to control for just differences that occur broadly over time. It's we'll talk about a paper of mine in a couple of slides where we did exactly that.
And just sorry to interrupt you, John. Like on that point, remember, like that's why I like to think about the DID when I talk about it as a pre and a post, right? So if your times are different, as far as you align the pre and the post and the time of the intervention, and like John is saying, control for the other things, it is easily generalizable to that.
You have to line, you got to line the specific treatment with the control. The treatment is endogenous, Sachin, you mentioned earlier. I mean, you'll see the paper of mine will talk about the treatment was endogenous. So you can still use DID, and you have, basically, hopefully you have to cross the threshold of interestingness, novel enough, and other stuff to allow the editors and reviewers to excuse the fact that, really, you're doing difference to difference, and that's great, but really you still have an unobservables problem here. And how severe is it? And can we let this paper go through, and do we believe the results? So Sachin gave the correct statistical answer that if it's endogenous, you just can't do it because you no longer have your ability to do the causal claim, and that's true. But often, we have very few, in my mind, pure studies, observational studies, where there's no alternative explanation or no risk of invalid causal claims. So you can think about it, how severe the endogeneity is. So I just want to comment on that.
Yeah, and I think most of us who have dealt with practical research situations, especially in business settings, right? It is really hard to, there are a lot of situations where you can come up with a pure exogenous shock, but a lot of times you might be interested in things that are, relatively exogenous, or if you have made sure that all the other assumptions hold with regard to parallel tens, and you're relatively certain that alternative explanations would not explain the effect, I would feel comfortable that I can apply DID for my research, and I would feel comfortable in the claims that I make. It gets back again, right? Have you ruled out other biases, anything else that you as a researcher can do to make sure that this is a valid claim that is warranted? And of course, we go through the review process that helps us in some ways to make sure that we're doing that. It also gets me back to the earlier question, is if we do really have a nonlinear effect that just goes back right to where it was in the post period, it is really difficult, if not impossible, to tease that out, because it's very hard for you to say that that was because of that intervention or something else caused it. So in situations like that, you want to be a little more careful. There might be a way where your post period is 2 periods, right? Because if there is any nonlinearity, you should see that blip of the intervention effect before it goes back to normal. And some of those things you might be able to handle by either looking at a phased post period or taking a more granular time specification, or and if you can't, right, it really gets to the question: can I really tease that effect out? As I try to analyze it.
And so you also should be kind of graphing your scatter plots. It might be hard to see something, but if there is some nonlinearity, you can maybe detect it. And on the top of my head, I don't know how easy it would be to just model it as well, but I think it does get a lot less clean than what we're talking about. I don't know if you can see my Q&A, Sasha, and I opened up the Q&A, but I think I'm only sharing the PowerPoint. But if you open up the Q&A, I'll answer a couple questions and you can answer the others. Exemplar papers, we're going to, I don't know if they're exemplars, but we're going to show 4 papers in the next 2 slides. We can share the slides, absolutely. And then the other questions about the dotted line. Do you see that now in the Q&A? It's also in the chat, actually.
Yes. So I think there are more complicated ways for you to actually come up with the counterfactuals, but yeah, we do get estimated of what we would expect the effect to be. But again, remember that counterfactual is very, very highly sensitive to your parallel trends assumption. The moment you violate that parallel trends assumption, that estimated or what you're expecting would be the effect for your treated group had the treatment not occurred is violated completely. So to the extent that that parallel trend assumption holds, you're more confident in that as a counterfactual.
And
then
the last question in the Q&A, is it normally expected to include time fixed effects in the DiD design? Don't they create multicollinearity? Let me just make one comment. I think if you have a study like mine where the interventions are occurring at different times and you need to include time fixed effects, because you normalize them all to zero. But in a normal DID, an ideal DID where one thing happens at the same time to one group and not to another comparable group, I believe you don't. Is that correct, Sasha?
Yeah. Yes. And if you go to the previous slide, John, I think I can verbalize that a little better, where we had the equation for the.
And there's also a question about the treatment being a continuous variable where you can chew on.
Yep.
For a moment.
I'll take both of those in that. I can
Okay.
take
For some
both of
reason.
those
Going back is
oh, there it is.
Forward.
Yeah.
There it is. Okay.
So, on this slide, I put a very general time fixed effects. Now, if you have, let's say, a 4-period design, right? So pre-period, post 1, post 2, post 3, post 4, you would have that many dummy variables for the posts. So you'd have a post 1, post 2, post 3, post 4, right? So yes, you would not put a time fixed effect. Now, if you want to be really general, I just included the time fixed effects. But the moment you try to group multiple, let's say we have monthly observations and you try to group them in, let's say, 3 years, yes, you will have multicollinearity and the time fixed effects are not needed. Now, does the model work when the treatment is a continuous variable? When we start off with the DiD, we're really in a 2-group treated versus not kind of a situation. And you could always dichotomize your continuous treatment variable. But the model itself, yes, you can estimate the model if your treatment is continuous. And actually, if you generalize it, and if you look at the model here, if I had a continuous treatment variable, this treat times time, remember, time takes on a dummy variable when treatment occurs or in our post period. Right? So your continuous variable would have a non-zero value only when the treatment is occurring. So this would be basically your continuous variable with the non-zero value, right? All other times, even in your treated group, this continuous variable would have a value of 0 because it has not experienced that treatment at all. You would have a control group with this variable, treated times time, as 0 all the way through. So we have generalized it to be able to apply with the continuous variable. Now, you want to make sure that you have a control group though. So you would have a whole bunch of zeros on your variable in the control group because they have not experienced the treatment at all. Now, if you say that, hey, can I do this when even my control group has experienced a certain level of variability in the treatment? Yes, you can. But if you look at the model, we are right back into a traditional fixed effects panel model setting. So we can actually generalize this all the way down to what would happen. Now, coming back to my earlier comment, remember your treatment has to be exogenous. Your shock has to be exogenous, which if I have generalized it all the way to a fixed effects model, I'm saying that my X variable has to be exogenous. If it is the exogenous X variable that I have, and I'm pretty sure it is exogenous, I can use my fixed effects model to estimate my causal effect. I can generalize this all the way down to that. I hope that answers the question. And John, hopefully I haven't gone completely wrong there.
Regression discontinuity, which we'll talk about in a second. If you have a continuous treatment where once the treatment passes a certain threshold, the treatment actually occurs, and below that threshold it doesn't, that's essentially a continuous treatment, but it has a threshold, that then you would be able to use regression discontinuity. I'm not sure that's what you were talking about, but no. Stay tuned for that. Yeah. Should we go to the papers?
Yes. So I wanted to ask a question here.
Go ahead, Dave.
So one question I had was on sample size requirements. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, should you have more or less of a sample for your treatment versus control? And then what is generally an accepted guideline in terms of how big a sample do you need for treatment and control conditions?
I don't. So two things there, right? Let me do the easier one first, right? The generally accepted guideline for treatment and control. You might see studies with so traditionally when we deal with panel data, we have thousands of observations, but in a DID design, you might see studies which have a few hundred treated observations and a few hundred controls. So a small sample study, for me at least, if I was working on the paper, if I was trying to draw conclusions, as far as I have a good sample, and as far as I have a good setting where I'm confident about my treatment being relatively exogenous and my groups being comparable, I think I'd be comfortable with what we would now consider a relatively smaller sample of treated observations having a similar number approximately of the control observations to go on. In terms of whether we would want more in the treated in the control group than the treated group, or equal or more. I discussed this with John a little bit before too. I think, and John can chime in too. There is not necessarily a stated reason that you would necessarily want to have more in the control than the treated group, as far as your control group is representative. Now, having said that, and this is where I think researcher preferences, choices, and comfort level also kick in. I think it is helpful if you do, but if your control is representative, as far as I understand, it would not be an explicit requirement.
And all I can say is this is if your dependent variable is continuous, this is an ordinary least squares regression ultimately that you're running. So
Yeah.
It doesn't have the big, large sample asymptotic estimators. And I ran it as a robustness check in one of my papers, a DID with, I don't know how many, but it must have been like 40 observations. And we actually found a significant interaction effect, somewhat surprisingly. So when you think about OLS, it doesn't require large sample to make valid inferences, as long as the residuals meet the or small samples, you can't even really check that. But as long as the residuals are not unreasonable, as long as you have reasonably not violating the IID and normality assumption of the residuals. So it's OLS. It doesn't require large samples to get valid inferences. I was smiling when you asked your question because Sachin mentioned that yesterday to me, and my flippant answer was, I don't know, I never would even thought of that. I mean, when I think of DID, some of the classic examples would be like, one intervention happens in one state, and then you find a neighboring state where it didn't happen, and look at the manufacturing plants in state A and not in state B, and maybe it's Ohio and Indiana, similar states. And if one of them happens to be bigger than the other, the treated or the control, it would never occur to me that that's a problem. So, but it's interesting you brought that question up, Kasasha, and I discussed the same thing last night. So it's quite possible I'm missing something. I'm not in the kind of nutrition. I'm not. Yeah. I have to struggle through this stuff every time I get into it, just like everybody does. But that's not something I would immediately think of as a concern.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Another question in the chat box.
Okay, so let me try to field what I see here. So I'm just going to read the question out for the benefit of everyone. You might have already said, but there have recently been quite a few proposals as to how to deal with staggered adoption times. What approach would you recommend to deal with this? If it's the same treatment but different phases, you can use the generalized DID because your staggered adoption times are just phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Unless I'm understanding the question incorrectly.
I would understand
so
it as maybe staggered, like different. Sorry, I always go to like plants or different observations receive the intervention at different times. So maybe like the government rolls something out over time. So the observations only get it once, but they get it at different times.
At different times.
My answer there, which I believe to be correct, is you can normalize all
Yeah.
of those times to
all those
0,
times
and then control for the time of the intervention as another variable.
as a
Uh,
pre and post. And this is similar to the question that we had earlier. What if the intervention is happening at different times? So if they're staggered, they're just in one direction, and you just align them, your event time or the intervention time to be time 0, and you have your pre and post.
We should probably talk about the papers real quick. And
Papers, yeah.
press on.
So
I don't have as much to say about RD as Sachin did about DID, but I do have a little
so
to say.
a couple of the papers that I just want to highlight, and the reason I want to try to highlight these is I think there are some very unique ways in which operations management scholars have used DID. And there's a paper by Gopeshanand and his colleagues, where, and I think this is the paper with Arvind as well, where they were actually able to redesign processes for kidney transplant at a hospital. So it's an example where intervention happened, and they redesigned the process for the kidney transplant, and the outcome of interest was readmissions rate and patient satisfaction. However, they were able to identify a control group in a unique way by picking patients in the control group from the same hospital who received heart or liver transplant, where they had designed the intervention for the kidney transplant. Sorry, I spoke a little earlier. Now, if it's the same hospital, you know that you're going to have very comparable other factors. Your treatment and control groups are going to be fairly comparable. You could, very strongly say that, organ transplant have similar complexity and etc. and requirements for these two processes, and it really gives you a setting where you can draw valid causal inferences with the DID approach, and they do have multiple phases that they analyze over. So if you need something like that, that's a really good paper that I would say that you can go to. Another one that I felt was really creative in how they identified the control group was a study by Kislet and Vikram Tiwari was also involved in the study. And what they'd done is they had introduced a IT prompt that would go out during the surgery to inform what might happen or how long that surgery might take, and see how that would affect surgeries that are scheduled in the same OR throughout the day. And they wanted to, based on that, see if there's improvement in the preoperative patient processing time. Because once a patient comes in, he's going to wait and get into preoperative area and then go into the surgical area. They wanted to improve the preoperative patient processing times by getting prompts from the OR. Now, that prompt can only arrive from the second surgery of the day, or can only affect the second surgery of the day, because you need a surgery to be happening in the OR to actually send you the prompt. So the prompt would never come for the first surgery of the day. And that's what they used to really identify what could be a control group. And there I again felt was like a really creative way, because you might be able to, especially in business settings, it's sometimes very difficult to find very clean DID settings, like we talk in theory. And you might be able to be really creative to identify what a control group versus a treatment group would be. And both of these are examples of interventions where the researchers went in and actually created an intervention, a good, really great place to apply DID. The next example that I think is also related on the next slide to a question that came up earlier, which is in a setting where there's a mandate, where pretty much everyone is receiving a treatment. Can you apply DID? And in the paper, Scott et al., they try to figure out their variable of outcome of interest is safety behavior for truck drivers. And the exogenous shock that they look at is a mandate, which is ELD mandate which was adopted. Now, in such a situation, pretty much because it's a mandate, everyone is going to get the treatment. So it becomes really hard for you to identify what would be a control group. And the way they identified a control group was to use carriers who were using ELDs prior to the mandate as their control group. So these carriers have always been using ELD in the pre and the post period, and they were able to identify the effect by using the treated group as carriers who adopted only in the post period and not in the pre-period. Now, you can always argue that there are drawbacks to situations like this, but in my opinion, some of these are really creative ways to come up with, what would be my treatment group, what would be my control group, what's a setting that I'm really interested in, and the outcome that I want to specify. And can I really warrant and make a claim that the effect I'm observing is because of the shock or the treatment that I'm interested in trying to quantify? And there's another really great paper, which is by John. So I'm going to turn it over to John and I'll let him talk about it.
So just to comment on the prior three, I mean, none of those are perfect, right? None of those are perfectly exogenous. So is your question interesting enough? Is it exogenous enough? Do you convince the yourself first, of course, and then the review teams that your results are valid? And with those carriers, they don't have to be identical. So you're probably thinking yourself, people who were using the LDs prior to the mandate are probably larger or whatever, but they have to have parallel trends, parallel slopes beforehand. So one might be higher than the other in the dependent variable of interest, but they have to have parallel trends. And then so Sachin put this in without my prompting. This was the original slide deck he sent to me, and I said, "Wow, you picked that paper, okay." And this is probably the least exogenous of the four that we're showing. I mean, we looked at ISO 9000 certification, and obviously, and we say it in the paper, there's unobservable differences potentially between plants that choose to implement ISO 9000 and plants that do not. But what we did was went through two different extensive matching algorithms, CEM and PSM, to match plants that got the certifications with plants that did not. We had a one-to-many matching algorithms. We did have more control than treatment in this paper. And then we took the date of ISO 9000 certification and basically checked pre and post ISO certification. I think the reason the paper got published was not because we had done flawless causal inference, but because we had some interesting results that brought together some contradictions in the literature. We were able to tease out the differences between getting certified early and kind of getting certified late, and also we're able to look at performance long-term after ISO certification. So that's an example of a paper that, it is a good paper, I do like the paper, but I'd say the biggest weakness in the paper is the lack of ability to deal with the unobservable differences between plants that got certified and plants that did not. But I'm happy to have Sachin have chosen it as one anyway. I will talk about a paper that I'm not working on, but some colleagues are. That's a good example of a pretty clean one. So there's a law called the GDUFA, the Generic Drug User Fee Act, that allows companies that requires companies to pay and to get a generic drug approved. But the deal is by paying now, the generic drug approvals will be quicker. And it obviously influenced all generic drugs. And so what they did was their control group is brand drugs. So branded drugs are clearly different than generic drugs, but they had parallel trends before GDUFA was implemented. And then we're able to see if adverse events or recalls or whatever they're using change. So it's another example, kind of more like the Scott et al., where it seemed like it implements everything that you care about, which is generics, but actually you can find a creative control group. So that's it for DID.
Well, I have one question before we move away from DID, just to follow up, and that's the empirical setting. So the two papers that you have here on the screen are studying behavior within a specific industry. So the Alex Scott papers, trucking, your paper, John, is the medical device industry. Could you talk about the pros and cons of the empirical setting, whether to focus on a specific industry or go look at cross industries when looking at exogenous shocks?
Yeah, so I didn't introduce myself fully, but I'm the department editor of the industry at the public policy department at JOM, and the senior editor of industry studies and public policy at POM, and I'm on the committee of the Industry Studies Association. So I'm a very big proponent of industry focused research, and it just becomes very hard. It's harder to, the broader you get, the harder it is to have the valid control group, I guess. You're not talking about having something happen in one industry as your treatment, another industry as your control. I assume that would be a little too, because then you'd have too many differences, maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, I'll just say my bias is, diving into an industry and understanding the industry in detail, and and doing research that way, but that's my bias. I probably missed your question entirely, and I'll let Sachin answer or be quiet.
So, see, that's where I think comparability between your treated and control groups start to become more important. So going back to the earlier question of also, do you have, same number of observations or equal or more in the treated, right? So if, let's say we have now 2 or 3 different industries, are they comparable on all the observables, at least that we can make, we can try to test? And do we have similar numbers or approximately at least have controls in all the industries that we have treated observations in? Because there might be settings, especially in operations supply chain setting, if I know John does a lot of industry focused stuff. I do some industry focused stuff, but I also do a lot of stuff that spans multiple industries, right? So if I was to try to implement this, I can see a situation where we might have multiple industry or firms and multiple SICs, let's say as an example. But I would want to make sure that both in the treated and the control across those industries, I have comparability. And now we're getting closer and closer to situations where we try to use matching because we could use various matching techniques, but that gets now to slightly a different area of where we start to match and make sure. But hopefully, I'm answering your question and not just rambling.
Go ahead.
No, you did. I mean, because I don't know what the background is of the participants. I mean, if someone's just kind of new to this and just wants to get started versus those who are more in details in terms of how to implement this. So what are these are the kinds of questions about how do you get started? How do you design your study? So that people are more informed in terms of being able to benefit from DID and understand some of the challenges with implementing it.
I will say, if you do have a different industry, so if you have something an intervention that's put upon one industry and not another, and you can establish, it's a little harder to convince everyone that the unobservables and control group are different enough. But I mean, if you can establish parallel trends before the intervention that hits one industry and not the other, and then you can see a difference, you could probably plausibly argue that that's that the intervention or that was the cause. So I see there are a few questions, but I think I'm going to take liberty and just go forward real quick and just cover RD, and then maybe David can help us sort through the questions. Otherwise, I'm afraid we're going to hit 1 o'clock. And so I'll be quick though. RD is going to be covered it's kind of a niche method. So Sachin, maybe you can look at the chat and plan some answers to the questions while I'm running through.
Yep, I can do that.
So let me just run through regression discontinuity. I've actually seen the term that's used in our journals, and it's another very simple, elegant method that does require probably an even more special situation than DID. So basically what you're doing when you use regression discontinuity is taking advantage of thresholds to analyze similar groups. So there's some cutoff where one gets treated, another does not. Example might be like a bunch of researchers apply for grants, and there's some continuous score, and everyone who scores above 80 gets the grant, and those who score below 80 do not. You can look at the groups that were near 80, the researchers that were near 80, and you can argue that they're similar in all sorts of ways. They chose to apply to the grant, they got a score right close to the matching, right close to the threshold, and then you can argue that any difference you see from the researchers who got it and those who didn't was caused by receiving the grant. So future productivity or something like that. I'll show a couple other simple examples. Obviously, that's not a setting that exists everywhere, but I'll show a couple examples. So I think I basically just said this. You can isolate the effect of the treatment. And because they both were close to this threshold, you can assume that they're similar otherwise, an important characteristic. So here's a cool paper. So these are the graphs that typically come with RD. And so looking at whether unions affect innovation. And what they focused on here is union votes that occurred. And although these graphs go from 0 to 100 in various tests, they really only looked at the middle, the union votes that were close to 50%. So looking at plants that just barely passed a union vote versus plants that just barely didn't pass. So, and obviously they don't have a huge sample size here, But you can kind of see in the graph that it looks like, if you trust that citations per patent or patents is a valid measure of innovation output, then it seems like a plant, an operation voting to be unionized does seem to have a negative influence on innovation. And if you compare this to, let's say, going out and doing an observational study and looking at comparing plants that are places that are unionized versus places that aren't, and trying to just compare patents, you're missing, there seemed like there might be a lot of unobservables that led to the unionization occurring, et cetera. Whereas here you're really isolating, okay, plants that a union vote occurred, plants that it got close to 50%, and then seeing the difference just in that relatively small group. An even more elegant one that I discovered when I was preparing for this is probably the cleanest graph I've ever seen in these, is looking at public projects. So at a threshold of $150,000, if the budget of your project is $150,000 or more, you're subject to a certain amount of oversight by the government. And you have to do some things for that. And that's to protect, I guess, the taxpayers from overspend or what have you. But that also costs time and effort on the part of the contractors. And so quite dramatically here, almost unbelievably dramatically, even the numbers on the y-axis here are not, I don't know exactly what they are, but there seems to be a pretty dramatic, at least statistical effect between having a project over 150 and under 150 on both delay and cost overrun. And so again, these researchers found a situation where there was a threshold, and they exploited it to go and try to get a causal effect of having government oversight. And of course, it's just this particular type of government, the exact government oversight that was required. And we're able to find a very interesting effect, I think. And the last one, this was a little trickier, but corporate social responsibility and performance. And here, the y-axis is abnormal return on the day of the vote, and the vote was a vote to implement some corporate social responsibility initiative. And you can see close to the zero vote margin, there does seem to be a difference in the abnormal return. So maybe where the market expected, it wasn't sure what was going to happen. And the vote, it was voted down. There was a negative abnormal return. And then when it was voted up, there was a positive abnormal return. So the conclusion is that the market rewards corporate social responsibility initiatives, at least in cases where they didn't know what was going to happen. Okay, and you can see get away from zero, and there's really nothing going on. So there's almost no abnormal return once the vote margin gets close to 50 in either direction. So I think the example does the best. And I told you I'd cover this very quickly. But just a couple notes about it. It's a very elegant method. You can publish it in economics journals if you can find it an interesting enough situation and an elegant method. It's difficult to find those thresholds, though. The insights really only apply to observations close to the threshold. So while it's elegant, when you step back and think about it, you're like, wait a minute. Okay, I found a causal effect of unionization, but it really only applies to the set of operations that could have been unionized and got to the point of a vote. And are these causal results really apply broadly across all organizations? And then you can step back farther and say, well, do I care? Because really the only ones that matter are the ones that almost got unionized, right? The ones that have no chance of getting unionized maybe aren't interesting, and the ones that are already unionized maybe aren't interesting. And even Flammer's abstract, that was the CSR one. And she says, I document the close call CSR proposals. And so although my results may imply adopting close call CSR proposals is beneficial to companies, they do not necessarily imply that CSR proposals are beneficial in general. So right there in a very short abstract is that caution. And still have to be careful, right? So a good reviewer will still think about, okay, so I have this supposedly exogenous threshold, but maybe if I'm a contractor for the federal government or for the government, I know that if I bid 149, I'm not subject to oversight, and maybe I'm also more experienced and better contractor. And so I split the project into $349,000 projects, so I don't have to see oversight. I didn't read that paper closely, but I would imagine they have some considerations of that and appease some people. So there is a threshold. Same thing with the research example I gave. Might there be some the scores that reviewers give might depend on unobservable researcher characteristics. And therefore they might push someone over 81 if they want to give the money to, and drop someone below the 80 that they don't. So you still have to, it's not perfect, but it's just a pretty elegant method that I want to make people aware of, and see if we can find some more of these in operations. I did not find, some of these are observations, but I did not find any in JSCM, JOM, POM on an admittedly relatively short search. Okay, so I also didn't spend hours and hours trying to find one, but I did not find examples in our journal, in the OM journals, OSCM journals. And I made it sound really easy. I didn't really get into the detail of the regressions as Sachin did. You know, you got to figure out what the local range is. You got to figure out the functional form before and after. You saw some non-straight lines before and after the thresholds, and there's a lot of, if you see the papers, there's a lot of justification and argument that needs to go into those decisions. And that's all I had on regression continuity. So I'll say a few things, and then I think we will have time for the questions, which I know there's already several on DiD. I don't know if there'll be any on RD. But just as you know, as an editor and an author, and you know, someone who has to struggle with this every time I'm reviewing a paper or writing a paper, you know, closing causal inference with observational data is difficult. We focused on two elegant methods, but ones that require you to find special settings, which are sometimes very hard to find. So you can't always use these. We did not talk about matching much. You know, matching by itself can be sometimes a method if you do it well enough. We didn't touch instrumental variables, two-stage approaches. You can possibly argue adequate control. You have, you know, if you can tick off all the alternative explanations and say, I controlled for that, I controlled for that, I controlled for that, you know, you could possibly publish a paper where the main approach, main method is OLS. And then usually you're going to be expected to do some robustness checks, but that's not out of the question. So again, the validity is the key thing. And I believe this is our last slide. So I didn't see too many more questions pop up. So maybe
let me go through some, and then I think I tried to answer one and it made the question go away. I just want to reiterate, this question had come up earlier too. And I hope I didn't create a confusion with my earlier slide where I had a time fixed effect. So if you have a time dummy variable, it would be collinear with the time fixed effects. It's basically the same thing. You would have one or the other. I'm gonna pick a couple of questions. Most of these get to identifying whether the treatment group is exogenous enough or not. One question that I see here is, for a less exogenous treatment, can we run a selection model before a DID? Now, again, remember, we are now getting, if you're running a selection model before, we need to have identifying variable in the selection model, which essentially now we are getting into a selection model where we are instrumenting our treatment of sorts. So, you know, we are now starting to think of techniques that we can use when our treatments are not completely exogenous. And we again start to get into techniques that I think might be more appropriate with using either some kind of instrumented variable approach, etc. John, anything on that?
Yeah, I agree. And the instrumental variable approach we intentionally stayed away from. It's technically, obviously, a bit less. What word did we use earlier? Easy to implement, etc. It's very hard to find good instruments. It's very hard to articulate what a good instrument is. Yeah. It's very hard. It's a bit black boxy. A lot of the methods to kind of trust the results unless you have a really clean. Really, if the instrument isn't in essence exogenous. Too many examples they give is things like the Vietnam. Some of the examples from the economics literature feel fairly exogenous anyway. Yeah. So yeah, I guess So I agree with that. I'll really quickly take the next one, which is just an RD question. How are we defining threshold? Threshold is defined by the setting. So in the union vote, if you get above 50%, you have a union. If you get below 50%, you don't. In the CSR vote, if it's same thing. And then the other one was the budget. If the budget of the project is over 150,000, you get government oversight, or a specific type of government oversight. If it's under 150,000, you do not. So the threshold is defined by the setting, and the threshold is basically what, if you stick with things close to the threshold, you can argue they're similar in all of their characteristics. That's the key trick, I guess, of RD. That was an easy question that I took.
Yeah, there's. Oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
was going to
Okay.
say other questions back to you, Sasha.
So there's another one that I see here that I think I can take is if the treatment and control are subject to precisely the same source of endogeneity. And the example is CEO apology versus a spokesperson of apology in the wake of a corporate social responsibility event. So once again, right, when I think of this example, the exogenous enough part to me is the event, right? So we're concerned about the exogeneity of the shock, which is the corporate social irresponsibility event. And the outcome of interest would be, let's say, what happened to the stock price of the firm, or what happened to the financial performance of the firm, or some kind of a customer satisfaction index for the firm. And if I wanted to look at whether who is making an apology is making a difference, now I'm starting to do interactions with my treatment for the X variables. So I see that who is doing the apology more as a moderator, which I think we can analyze that.
Sasha, sorry to interrupt, but if you're going to be studying given an apology happened, so if that's your domain of interest, could you then not just define one as the treatment, one as the control, and as long as they have parallel trends before the apology occurs, then you're basically looking at a difference between CEO apology and
versus the spokesperson. Yeah, I
feel like that's plausibly acceptable. I mean, this all depends on what reviewers you get, how interesting the rest of the paper is, how well you argue it. But I feel like you could define one as treatment as control. You're only studying given that an apology occurred. You're right. If you want to look at the broader world where no apology occurs, then you've got a messier situation.
And given that an apology occurs between two different groups, is there a difference? I think you might be able to, but yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where there is plausibility of applying it, and with the other factors being okay, I think that should be okay. Same thing I think with the, okay, John, do you want to take the treatment decision made by a focal unit as an M&A decision or an organization restructuring decision?
I was looking at an easier question. I missed that one. I'll take the easier question. What do you think about that?
Okay.
It's actually not that easy question, but yeah, there was a question about matching. Sorry, I went right to the bottom of the chat is what I was looking at now. I'm not even looking at the Q&A. I apologize. So let me just, someone asked, would you prefer propensity score matching or course and exact matching? And the short answer is, until about 3 weeks ago, I would have given you a pretty strong course and exact matching preference, because it's to me it's just as much more intuitive. You have the treated and control groups end up being individually observably similar in the observables, because you match on each variable and you don't allow them to be different. Whereas with propensity score matching, you're matching on the output of a logistic regression, basically. And so you're matching only on that dependent variable, the probability of exposing themselves to the treatment. And so you could end up with very different looking observations who happen, when all of those variables come together, they end up having the same propensity score, but they don't look the same. And CEM has gotten a lot of traction in the field, but I am experiencing a revision of a paper, and the editor gave us a paper by Bernie Black and others, and I'm sharing, unfortunately. I guess I can close my sharing, but that argues that CEM is inferior to some of those methods because it actually tends to cause more loss of observations. And I'm summarizing very briefly, and we're still absorbing what this means for our paper. So I like Courson's exact matching because I understand it. It's simple. They observe the treatment and control end up being similar in all traits that you're trying to match on. There are those who like propensity score matching. Often you'll end up just having to do both, right? You pick the one that you think is right. You'll probably be asked to do PSM as a robustness check anyway. Whether you do it before first submission or not is up to you. But that's a bit of a long answer. And I know that there are people who feel strongly about PSM as better, but what I don't like about it is the treated and control groups end up looking different individually with PSM.
So the next, so I'll take that question. So the question is, if a decision for something like an M&A or a major restructuring is of interest instead of a natural disaster, would a DID approach work? And once again, this gets back to a situation where I have to answer maybe. Like, so for a natural disaster, I would definitely say you can do a DID, right? But now if it is a M&A decision or organizational restructuring decision, it could work. I mean, it's similar to a certification adoption decision or a process adoption decision in some ways where we have seen it applied, and I think it is possible. But then again, it depends on making sure that some of the other assumptions hold, and your paper in a broader picture has theoretical arguments that plausibly help, and other aspects that are really interesting as well.
You're gonna have a uphill to climb with the reviewers if no going in, right? An M&A decision. Clearly, there's some unobservable characteristics of the M&A. Your control group is not going to be a true, pure control group. And so if you're going into, if that's the study you're going into, you better feel like the research question is really interesting. There's no other way to do it with real, more pure causal inference. This is cleaner than just doing a regression, let's say. But it's like my ISO 9000 paper, right? I don't know that when we started that paper, we knew. By the time we published it, we certainly knew that, there's just a lot of, the potential, the control group is not pure, I guess is what I'm saying.
So I can take the next question, which is, where does event study method stand in terms of causality? I'm a big fan of event studies. And so if you really, so it rests on the efficient market hypothesis, and we're going to assume that holds because that is what everyone is like. It is a given when you do an event study. It's really unique when you're doing an event study because the firm itself is used as a control. So when you estimate the abnormal returns, you're using the firm itself as a control and estimating the abnormal returns. So your cumulative aggregate abnormal returns that are estimated from an event study, if you have done it correctly, are something that you can attribute as causal, that it was that event that caused that blip in the investor reaction. Now, when we do a post-event regression after the event study to see if anything changed that investor reaction, we are again back into our original world with issues of whether that reaction or the explanatory variables we are using for the car are endogenous or not. But your actual event reaction that you capture with the event study, you can attribute to the reaction, assuming that it has been carried out correctly with no other confounding announcements, events at that time. The reason I'm a big fan of it is, again, it's one of those unique things where you're using the firm itself as a control to calculate the abnormal returns.
Say slightly differently. I mean, the abnormal return does require the rest of the market kind of as a control in essence. I mean, it's not.
Yes.
It's the abnormal word means you're comparing it to something, which is whatever the rest of the market was, or the rest of the relevant market was. I've never done an event study, so I don't know the details of it, but yeah, I think it's where it stands in terms of causality is on pretty strong footing, right? I mean, as long as you believe the efficient market and you have no confounding things that happen to your firms of interest, it seems like it's got a pretty solid.
Yeah. Another question was, what are the benefit of using the method? I'm assuming referring to the DID and NRD. I think if you have a correct setting identified, where the setting is really something that you can apply these in, you have a very elegant, conceptually and empirically simple method that can be applied to allow you to draw causal inferences. And to me, that is where I believe these methods are quite powerful, because, I mean, I'm not an expert on RD, and I have not implemented that. But with regard to DID, it is relatively, if you're doing it right, straightforward to implement. Given that you have identified a good setting and a good exogenous shock, so to me that's a big advantage, of having access to the method.
So there's a question about control group. Any guidance with respect to using a single matching firm versus multiple? I think you usually end up using one to many. So you get your treated group, and then if you do, say, coarse and exact matching, you define what is close enough, and you play with those calipers to get an adequate control group size. But if if you're if you have a bunch of similar entities to your treated group, I believe that's better than just picking the closest one. Just gives you more sample size. And also, yeah, so that's usually end up one to many. I don't know if that's, I believe that's my answer. I'll go with that. See if there's anything else. I'm in the Q&A right now. It looks like we got most of them there.
Yeah.
I looked back at the chat. So fifth methods are effect size and DID. I mean, that's pretty easy, right? The that's beta 3, right?
Yeah.
In the simplest example, in the 2-time period, two groups, it's basically beta 3 is the effect size, right? The interaction term.
Yep.
Is that, am I oversimplifying it, Sachin?
No.
If you're talking about effect
unless,
size in terms of the practical effect, I'm not talking about effect size necessarily in terms of like what percentage of R squared was. I guess you could do that pretty easily too with the beta 3. Is that?
Yeah. Unless I'm misunderstanding the question, no, you could turn.
Yeah, so you can get some practical. I mean, you can get a pretty easy idea of the practical implication of the treatment if you have a clean DID, particularly again with 2 time periods and 2 groups. That's when it's the most simple.
So
Um,
we're also at 12:55, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you both. I mean, does anyone else have any further questions about this topic of causality and how Sachin and John are recommending, or one approach or 2 approaches on how to address establishing causal relationships with observational data? Well, great. Well, I think we're happy to distribute the slides that were used for today's presentation. And in those slides, as you know, there were some references to some articles that are using the DID approach and the RD approach. So I certainly encourage people to look through those examples. And we hope that today's discussion was helpful to you to learn more about these causal models that John and Sachin talked about. So thank you both for hosting today's session. This was very excellent. I'm glad that you were able to host today's talk.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.